All right, looks like we're live. I'm going to be posting the links on Facebook. Start getting some people in here so we can talk about what's going on. If you guys can hear me, let me know if volume's okay, everything else. Hey guys, can you just verify that you can hear me? We're going to get started in just a few minutes here. I just wanted to give people time to get in if they wanted to. I had posted that I might go live or record a video or write something out. It really just kind of depended on interest, but some things have changed just in the last hour and a half or so that I wanted to talk about live. So give me just a few moments here to give everybody a opportunity to get in here, and we'll get started. All right, is the chat working? If anybody else is in here, could you please try to put something in the chat? Let me know if that's working. Hey, there we go. Thanks, Josh. Kind of wondering if I should be doing it here or doing it live on Facebook. I've had mixed results in the past, and it kind of seemed like people preferred live on Facebook. Not really sure if that's what I should be doing. I'm not sure if I could do both at the same time, but let me take a look here. Sorry for the brief delay, guys. I mean, it is Friday night and it's starting to get cold. I don't think anybody wants to listen to me rant too long, so I appreciate you guys tuning in. And I'm going to see if I can get this taken care of as quickly as possible. I was hoping to get a few more people in here just so I could address some questions, but I do have a list of things that people had asked earlier today that I'll be addressing, in addition to a few other things that happen kind of behind the scenes, people messaging me and so on. So give me just a few minutes here. If you could please bear with me, let some people get in here. And if people are too busy on a Friday night, that's no problem. I'll just continue without, and I'll leave this up in public on the YouTube channel so people can, you know, come back to it and watch it. I'll just trim it down and cut off the front end of it. Okay, so I guess we're going to get started here. First and foremost, I have to, as always, make a quick disclaimer. This is my opinion, of course, and it is solely my opinion. I do not condone, nor will I facilitate piracy in regards to HP tuners. I've said this in every single post. I've said this in every single video. It's astonishing, really, that still that doesn't seem to get through to a few people. But let's continue. A few things have changed. Am I still rolling back firmware? Yes, I am still rolling back firmware. Some changes have been made to recent updates that have made it a bit more difficult. They are actively trying to prevent me from continuing to do this. And some changes were made quite a few months ago now, actually, in order to prevent me from doing what I've been doing for quite a while. This is the first video in which I'm acknowledging and talking about the fact that those measures that they were taking in order to prevent that really didn't slow anything down. A few things changed, and I don't want to talk too specifically about that for a number of reasons, but it didn't take long to overcome a few changes that were made. Before we get into the rest of that, I want to talk first and foremost. People ask me quite a bit when I post about downgrading firmware. How do I know if I need to do it? And at what point was things force upgraded? And these types of questions. And I'd like to point them to this video after I chop off the front of it in order to answer those questions. First and foremost, if you need to ask if this is affecting you, it more than likely is not. And that's a good thing. If you've been upgraded to firmware 121 and you're using a version of VCM Suite that is newer than 4.4 and it's working for your uses on a MPVI 1, then congratulations. You are not affected by this. And there are plenty of people out there that aren't going to be affected by this. And that's okay. I don't want to scare anybody into thinking that there is some huge detrimental problem caused by a forced firmware upgrade if they aren't able to recognize it themselves. If they aren't able to recognize it themselves, chances are you didn't need some of the functionality and capabilities and things that were lost as part of that forced firmware upgrade that was not disclosed prior to the upgrade. And if it's working for you, then it's fine. If it's doing what you need it to do, you do not need to downgrade that firmware. You can continue to use it just as it is. If you think maybe there might be some use case, legal of course, for an earlier firmware in the future, then feel free to contact me. But if that's something that you need, chances are that you're going to know about it. So if it's not something you're familiar with, there's a good chance everything's fine and you can continue using the product. All is well. There's no need to panic. Okay. Next up, people ask quite a bit about what version does this and what version does that, and understandably so. this is one of the real issues that I've had with HP tuners for quite a few years now, is that they do not disclose in their changelog notes some of these changes to firmware. And I think that's incredibly deceptive. I can't recall another company that I've had hardware, whether it be for tuning cars or programming devices, whether it be for something as simple as like a CH341, chip programmer, or something much bigger, much more expensive. I cannot recall the last time I saw somebody that snuck a firmware upgrade in without telling their customers about it. It's extremely deceptive, and it's unacceptable, in my opinion. HP tuners should be held responsible for this, not properly educating and not properly notifying their customers that by downloading a newer version of software, it was going to force a firmware upgrade that may or may not prevent them from continuing to service their customers in legal markets or with legal solutions. Okay, and they're going to argue that, oh, we had to do this because of the EPA and diesel emissions and things like that. But look, we all know that's bullshit. We know it's bullshit because they'll sell you the ability to use user-defined parameters, and as long as you've got a definition file, if you will. There's different versions of that depending on the manufacturer. But if you've got a definition file and you're willing to pay them for user-defined parameters, you still to this day can delete diesels. So arguing that this is simply a compliance issue, that their hands are tied, they have no choice but to remove this functionality, it's all bullshit, okay? What they've done is they have panicked because pirated software was released, and in order to prevent you from using that pirated software, they forced a firmware update that they argued was for compatibility and new features and so on. But that firmware prevented you from using software older than when that firmware update essentially was pushed. It prevents you from using the older software that had been cracked. And there are a few different versions out there, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But first, let's talk about the software versions themselves. To my knowledge, and now I cannot say specifically, because in order to tell you exactly what revision this software started pushing a forced firmware update, I would have to reverse engineer that software, which is illegal. And I can't do that. I've never done that, and I will not do it. I have made certain that throughout everything that I've done, all the services that I've offered, I've kept things on the up and up, and I've got my ducks in a row. Okay? So the near as I can tell, because they obviously don't publish this information, letting you know when it is you're going to be forced to upgrade the firmware, I can only go by the reports in the forums and on Facebook. It appears as though that forced firmware update was included in 4.4.2. And when that release came out, there was an overwhelming response on the forums and on Facebook in regards to incompatibility. People are suddenly realizing that they've lost the ability to use these older versions of VCM Suite. And again, without reverse engineering that software, I can't confirm if it happened, maybe one iteration before that or so, but it's very close to that. 4.4.2 is when these reports started coming in about a forced firmware update. I hope you understand. I would love to tear that apart and know that for certain, but I can't legally do that. And so I think that this is a good guesstimation, okay? So people say, well, what software can I use without risking the forced firmware update? Well, if my guesstimation on the 4.42 is accurate, then you could technically use 4.2, but 4.2 was riddled with application key issues. There was a few betas in that period, and also in the 4.3 build chain that allegedly solved those application key issues, but I haven't used those builds, so I don't know exactly what build revision that was eliminated. So as a general rule of thumb, it's my opinion, what I tell people: if you want to try to avoid being forced to update to 121 firmware, and you want to be able to preserve utilizing software back in the 3 point so on, 2 point so on, in a legal manner, that you shouldn't break over 4.0x. As far as I can tell, there was no issues with that. 4.0 and change is basically when the MPVI-2 was added to the software. It's just the turnover essentially from 3.7. They took 3.7, added support for the MPVI-2, and that's what became 4.0 and change. So if you are at all worried about forced firmware updates, it's my opinion to stick with 4.0 and change somewhere in there. And if you need capabilities that have been added after that, get a secondary interface, whether it's an MPVI-1, or the better option, obviously, would be to buy an MPVI-2, because there is some capability, obviously, that's been added specifically for that interface, and it's not compatible with the MPVI-1. I would strongly suggest, just to make things simple, keeping one laptop with 4.0 and change and the MPVI-1, and then purchasing an MPVI-2, which has certainly had some growing pains, to say the least. I think the release was embarrassing. The pro features that they added since then, they are indeed trying to play some catch up now, since, right off the hop, data logging was limited or not available at all. They didn't have the pro cable available when they launched it. And when they launched it, they botched all these technically not first gen interfaces. There was a serial interface that existed before the MPVI-1, but many people don't understand or realize that. If you need functionality that you can't get with an MPVI-1 or with 4.0 and change, get an MPVI-2 and have that on a separate laptop. There are absolutely legitimate and legal use cases for retaining older versions of the software and a MPVI-1. More importantly, they shouldn't legally be able to take that functionality from you as long as you're acting within the law. So let's talk about the firmware updates and what has changed there. Starting with, again, near as I can tell, 4.4.2 is when the MPVI-1s were forced to update to 121. So you download the update. In the changelog, there was absolutely no indication that there was going to be a firmware update that would prevent you from using older versions of the software. Okay? You download it, you open up the software, and it immediately starts loading up firmware that's going to prevent you from utilizing older versions of the software that has functionality that the newer versions don't. Now, I understand that HP tuners needs to play ball, or at least appear to play ball, with the EPA. The EPA is not screwing around. They came down on SCT very hard, and SCT essentially suspended all of their dealer access until when I say dealer, direct tuners, tuning houses and things like that, until they had completed not only a new training procedure, but essentially signed a waiver saying that they weren't going to try to circumvent federal emissions in the United States. But HP Tuners overlooked a very important piece. They've sold these interfaces and their software, their solutions all over the world for years. I have customers almost daily now sending me interfaces from Australia to downgrade firmware. Australia does have some emissions regulations in place. However, it works a little bit different than the United States, and there are still legal use cases for removing emission systems in Australia, especially on imported vehicles that are used for agriculture. Also, at this time that this happened, and this is where I need to step back and I need to explain something that I haven't previously shared. When this happened, I had a very good relationship with HP Tuners, with some of their engineers, with some of their upper management. I had made those connections and those business relationships through a company that I previously worked for, doing some engineering and product development for airflow related items in the performance space. Okay, I was fortunate enough to meet and become friends with somebody who was in upper management over at HP Tuners, and a very talented engineer as well. I've said right from the beginning, and have maintained this entire time, that I don't hold either of them personally responsible for this. When this happened, and I had a forced firmware update on one of my interfaces, specifically, an interface that I used to tune some diesel retrofits in fishing boats in Mexico. So emissions exempt, and this person in upper management and this engineer knew of this use and knew that it was legal. I reached out to them and said, hey, I got a problem here. I suddenly can't service my customers anymore. I need some help. These people went to their superiors, which ultimately is Keith, and was told that there will be no exceptions. They will not be downgrading firmware for anyone. Now, take one further step backwards. Quite a few years ago, I built a truck for a company that I was doing some product development for SEMA. I shipped that truck from SEMA directly to Mod Nationals in Valdosta, Georgia. In Valdosta, Georgia, I had the opportunity to sit down and speak with one of these people who is in upper management at HP Tuners, just to catch up and shoot the breeze and talk about ongoing projects. At that time, I brought up to him that there were some whispers about some pirated versions of HP Tuners at that time. He was quite surprised to hear that I knew of this, as he had just himself heard about it just the day before. Okay. At this time, I didn't know who was responsible for pirating and releasing this software. And it was still in, kind of the back channels of the ECM cracking community. It was not being widely shared, but I knew it existed. I hadn't at that point downloaded it. I hadn't looked at it. But this person, who is, again, in upper management at HP Tuners, asked me not only to download it and forward it on to him, asking me to try to get a copy of it, but also asked me if I would take a look and give him my opinion on how it was circumvented and some other just opinions, as somebody who has been in the space a while and understands how somebody might circumvent the licensing around this. And I did that. And again, at this time, I had absolutely no idea who was responsible for these cracked software leaks. But I did. I downloaded it and I forwarded it on to this person. And I also spoke with this person about what I thought was still in place or had been circumvented, because there's more than just validating licensing. There's a few other measures in place, and I provided that information to him. Now, in order to do that, I had to look at how this program's put together, essentially the source code of the software, which puts me in a unique position because I could alter this software then at that point to do the things that I'm doing now, but I didn't. I'm not an idiot. It would be very easy to argue that the information that I had gained from that is what allowed me to do what I'm doing now, provide the service that I'm providing now. I've made absolutely certain that the method that I've come up with after being turned away as a result of a forced firmware update has been what's called clean room. So if you've ever heard of, say, game emulators, you download a Super Nintendo emulator, a Nintendo 64 emulator to play some game on your computer. The reason that some of those are allowed to exist while the ROMs for those games are not allowed to exist is that the ROMs are proprietary information. The source code for the microprocessor in a Nintendo console or whatever the case may be, that's also proprietary information. And so in order to legally share something that will play one of those games, you need to essentially write that code from scratch, not using any of the source code from Nintendo. They own the rights to that. And that's what's called a clean room solution. You cannot utilize any information that could have been gained as a result of an illegal activity, which would be a violation of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, trademark. There's many different protections in place, but that is how it functions. So when I was told that there will not be any exceptions, even though I myself was in essentially the privileged position of having a contact in upper management at HP Tuners who knew that I had a legal and legitimate use case for these older versions of the software in diesel retrofits for fishing boats, fishing charter boats in another country, in that not only had I not ever pirated that software, but I had helped them both find it and understand how it worked long before I knew who was responsible for that software. They still told me no. And that is when I told these two people that I appreciated them. I didn't hold them personally responsible. And unfortunately, I had to cut ties with these two people because I was going to do what was right and find a method to downgrade this software, which you as a consumer, a product and software owner, have the right to. I had to tell these people that I couldn't continue to have a business relationship with them anymore because it would be a conflict of interest. And so it's at that point that I set out to create the method that I have now been using to downgrade software to restore original functionality in legal use cases, and under no circumstances have I condoned or supported the use of pirated software, and I have made that explicitly clear in every single post, every single video, and yet I still get messages to the contrary. As a matter of fact, when I made this post that I was going to be discussing this tonight, and some of the changes regarding the security around firmware and downgrading, which I do intend to get to in just a moment, I still get messages from people like Sergio Tuning, who wants to market a modified version of VCM Suite that was designed to downgrade firmware that I had notified the community existed and warned against using more than a year ago, I believe now at this point, telling people that this is out there, just as I talked about pirated versions of software that I didn't condone. And this software not only does not downgrade all versions of firmware, there's a bit of a gray area there, but it also does cause some complications, and more importantly, it violates copyright law. Okay, so I acknowledged it existed. I shared that it had shown up in a blip on the radar, but made very clear that I didn't suggest anybody downloaded it. I didn't download it. The people who claimed to download it, I kind of asked what was going on and what it was, and that's how I got an idea of how it worked. But I had a pretty good idea to begin with because, again, some of those back channels and PCM cracking areas and things, I had heard that somebody was working on something like this. It's my understanding that it's the result of changing some values, basically forcing a version of VCM Suite to perform a update regardless of a value return. And the firmware is 120, so even if firmware is 121 and it's, it should usually say you have a newer version of firmware, the software ignores that and forces a downgrade to 120. That's my understanding of it. But again, that's not something that I use. That's not something I'm in possession of. That's not something I've ever been in possession of. It's only something that I've shared as to discuss. No different than I have discussed the few versions of pirated software. And more importantly, it seems that this version of software is more frequently found in circles that are more apt to pirate software, something that I have very specifically tried to avoid. So Sergio messages me and says, oh, well, I can do this and I'm going to release it for free and so on. And I explained to him, although he didn't believe me, but I'm going to explain to all of you right now, that's a terrible idea. There are some ramifications. There are some breadcrumbs that are left by this method. You do risk having not just this device bricked, but the entirety of your account. It is illegal. And more importantly, this gentleman, Sergio, who assured me that I could call him out here after I asked him why he would, message me about this after I've made it clear that I don't want people to do that. This gentleman doesn't have any idea how this stuff works. It seems that he has, well, it doesn't seem. The only way he could have come into possession of this is just by downloading it through that torrent. Because I'm quite confident who developed or modified this software, and it certainly wasn't him. So if Sergio's going to offer you any services or post a video, as he says, letting people know how they can do it for free, I would strongly advise against that. And I would ask once again, if you, there is another gentleman who I'm not going to name because I do think that this person just simply didn't understand the situation. Tried to market to me just about an hour and a half ago a copy of that cracked version of HP Tuners. the most recent one, which is a revision of version 4. I think he underestimated the severity of what's at hand here and the legality of it. And after having a discussion with him, I think he does now understand and appreciate that. And so I'm not going to name this gentleman the way that I did Sergio Tuning. But I got to ask, please, 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 do not put me in a position that jeopardizes what I am doing. I have made very certain that the mechanism and the method that I use in order to provide you a way to downgrade these devices to a firmware that will allow you to maintain support for your customers or for your own vehicles in a legal manner is going to be jeopardized anytime somebody wants to try to shop some pirated piece of software to me or ask me to do something that is illegal. Guys, I gotta say again, the cracked versions of HP Tuner's VCM suite, I sent them to HP Tuners. I have a copy of it. I've not opened it. I've not used it beyond what someone in upper management asked me to do. I looked at it, gave my opinion on how that worked, how it functioned at their request, and I have proof of this. Beyond that, I do not use this software. I have not distributed this software, nor would I. It's not worth it. It's not worth it for me. My health and being able to provide a service at a reasonable cost that they're unwilling to provide, those are priorities right now. Why on earth would I open myself to the legal liability of sharing that software? That does nothing for me, but yet it induces all of the risk. Why would I modify that software and distribute it? That makes no sense. That's all of the risk for nothing. Okay? HP Tuners has proven that he is prepared to put his checkbook on the line to shut down people that are circumventing the licensing in this software, who are causing his business harm. Why on earth would I do that? And the people who are reaching out asking if I'd like a copy of this software, I got news for you. I had it a day after it was made. I sent it to them 2 days after it was made. You don't have to try to sell me on this. I don't want it. I'm not going to use it. I don't need it. Please, please, please stop trying to solicit me to buy these things, insisting you have something to offer me that I didn't already have on my own, okay? I don't need it. Now, that being said, I apologize. I'm quite worked up. Frankly, I'm a bit offended. So many of you have been absolutely awesome to work with. Your concern is only restoring legal functionality and taking care of your customers and preserving your business, which is the bread and butter for your families. And to all of you who are thinking about utilizing me to help you through that or have already done so, I want to thank you. And I apologize for getting as upset as I am now. I hate that there are some people who don't have any regard for that and want to jeopardize the legality of this or my ability to provide that service. And it really does upset me quite a bit. So I apologize. Now, let's talk about the changes to firmware itself, because a few things have changed. In 4.4.2, HP Tuners forced a firmware update to 121. Since that time, it appears that a few mechanisms surrounding security have changed. If you want to go back and look at some of my older videos, I've discussed the microprocessor that has been used in the MPVI-1's, the entirety of its use cycle. Those chipsets have a few different functions or a few different mechanisms in order to protect them, both from being read, being modified, and astonishingly, they really didn't make good use of those protections for a very long time. They're starting to do a bit better of a job. Not enough to keep me out. They made some changes about 6 months ago that made it a bit more difficult to roll back this firmware. And I think right up until this video, they had assumed that it had worked. This is where I'm going to publicly acknowledge that it didn't. It was cracked within a day. Setting a security bit to try to keep me out is not going to work. Not only is it not going to work, given the chip that's on this board, there isn't anything that you're going to be able to do that's going to keep me out. Okay, and more importantly, I'm not ever going to be kept out without doing something illegal. I've got my ducks in a row. I'm doing what's right. I'm providing the functionality that you sold to customers. And that's not going to change. I wish that HP tuners had done what was right by their customers and provided them a solution, especially since this really was a knee-jerk reaction to pirated software, but instead they hurt some of their most loyal customers in the process. But that being said, those of you who have had a failed firmware update and have had a bricked device, I can fix them. Those of you who are receiving error codes as a result of some trouble with syncing a license after a firmware update, and there's, unfortunately, and here's part of the problem, the validation flow, the way that all of that validation works since this first forced firmware update has changed a few times, a little, but it always comes back to the same thing. Oh, I got a problem, it didn't work. Oh, send us a ticket. Oh, well, now you got to send the device in. We're going to get it fixed for you. And I'm going to tell you right now, they're not sending your MPVI-1 back to you fixed. It's not happening. Okay. I said it in my last video months ago, and I still haven't got any responses. If you've sent an MPVI-1 to HP tuners as a result of a failed firmware update or some licensing issue or whatever the case, and you've got it back in working order in the last 6 months, send me proof, and I'll PayPal you a gift certificate to Best Buy for $50, or I'll PayPal you just $50 in general. First person to show me that, I'll send you $50. It's not going to happen. They don't want MPVI-1s in circulation anymore. That's quite obvious. So what they do is they allow these devices to continue having troubles with firmware updates and buggy and licensing. And, you know, I certainly couldn't argue that they've intentionally bricked any of these devices because, well, legally I can't do that. What I can do is give my opinion. And my opinion is it's been very convenient for them to allow these bugs to continue. And when you send in that MPVI-1, they're going to act as though they're doing you a favor by offering you the opportunity to upgrade. And they're going to migrate over these licenses at a charge, of course, saying, "Oh, yeah, well, we could take a look at it," and so on. That's where I have the problem. They're not repairing any of these devices. They're not attempting to repair any of these devices, in my opinion. I have not seen one case, one instance in the last 6 months to a year where somebody sent an MPVI-1 that had a failed firmware update or licensing issue or whatever the case may be, and actually got it back from HP tuners in working order. I haven't seen it. I'll be the first to admit if I'm wrong, and please, by all means, prove I'm wrong. I know that people at HP tuners are going to see this. If I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong. Show the community that I'm wrong. Discredit me in the best way possible. Show the community that if you send an MPVI-1 that has a failed firmware update or is having troubles with licensing, you know what's happening. Prove me wrong. Start sending these devices back and discredit me tomorrow. If not, I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing now, which is entirely legal. And I appreciate everyone who's given me the opportunity to restore the functionality that they paid for, the functionality that they continue to use in a legal manner. And I really do appreciate it. As you all know, I've been going through some health troubles over the last couple of years, and being able to work on this instead of turning wrenches has made things a bit easier on me to continue to pay through those things, medical and just life expenses. So thank you for that. I guess, Keith, I don't have any problem with you. I never have, aside from this. And if you're upset with me, man, reach out. But if you really want to put me down, start sending people's interfaces back fixed. Even if it's on 121. If you start sending MPVI-1s back to people working, that's the best way to discredit me and really put me out of the majority of this, other than people who need some of those unique uses, other countries and ag equipment, and I don't have to explain it to you. Anyways, that's the end of my rant. I've taken up enough of everybody's time here. We got, about 45 minutes since I started. Is there any questions before I sign off here? VJS, the limitations they're trying to force us in effect for Gen 3, Gen 4 LS stuff. VJ, no, not really. The vast majority of it now, I should go over this again for a moment, and I appreciate the question. There's a couple of different problems with this forced firmware update. There are people that have owned their interfaces long enough that they had old versions of software that still supported things like import and export of bin files. Okay. And at some point, HP tuners decided that they wanted to charge for that feature. And people who had that feature initially lost it as a result of this forced firmware update, as a result of this forced firmware update. It disappeared from newer versions in 3 point so on. But at least they could go back to the older 2 point-ish versions where it was still available, and they could use both. But when the forced firmware update went through, it required you to use a newer version of software, which wouldn't allow you to do that unless you had the correct application key. See, because they took it away so they could actually sell it back to people. Now, I will say that last time that I had this discussion specifically about bin files, someone had commented, I apologize, I'm drawing a blank on exactly who, but somebody from HP Tuners did reach out either on my video or on one of the posts on Facebook and that if anybody had purchased HP tuners, MPVI-1, or even one of the old serial interfaces during the time that the bin feature, import-export, was allowed, and they had lost that functionality, that they could send in a support ticket and that HP tuners would restore that functionality. I don't know if that's actually ever happened. I haven't heard from anybody who followed up and, you know, told me that they had sent that support ticket in and they got that access back. But that's what I was told. So that's one instance where this forced firmware update affected some people. The other is obviously in diesel emissions. So obviously, I wouldn't condone, and I can't obviously legally, deleting emissions on a device that is not eligible within the United States. That's illegal. And I can certainly understand where HP tuners and other tuning software companies have come under scrutiny, especially in recent years, in an effort to force them to comply with EPA regulations. The trouble that I have is this forced firmware update was not a result of that. Some people have tried to argue that it is, but it isn't. And we know that it isn't because they're still offering a very expensive process to unlock new Duramax PCMs, and they're still offering you the ability to use user-defined parameters, which are going to allow you to delete a new Duramax and other diesel platforms. Compliance is not something that they're doing. The mirage, the image, the illusion that they are complying is, which you could argue is a typical case of cover your ass. But that's not why the forced firmware updates, okay? They removed a lot of that diesel support way back in the 2. So on versions, yet the forced firmware update prevents you from using anything earlier than essentially 4.1. So why is that? Well, it's because the newest version of pirated software that exists is, or exists publicly, I would assume, I can't speak for anything else, but that I know of, is 4.06. They want to prevent people from using that. So they've limited your ability to utilize those functions that you've had and you may still use, like me, in a legal market because they were incapable of properly securing their software. Okay, so first semester college freshman with a .NET framework education could have broken 4.06. It doesn't take any more than that. To punish their customers because of their blatant lack of securing their intellectual property is laughable. So again, you know, I hate to be this asshole here or whatever, but the truth of the matter is they didn't secure their software. They didn't even try. Okay. If my MPVI on 121 bricks, can I send it to you and unbrick it and update it back to 121 for use for newer vehicles? JD Reynolds, yes, you can. However, I will tell you this. There are some mechanisms in place to brick interfaces as a result of using pirated software. I'm not going to discuss how that works because ultimately HP Tuners has every right to do that, okay? They have a right to protect their intellectual property. And people bitch all the time about how this was supposed to be an open source project when it started, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, sure, fine. That doesn't excuse the fact that Keith and the other owners, well, owner now, have spent a lot of money, a lot of time. They've invested a lot in this project, and they deserve to recuperate those investments, as do the engineers who work very hard to provide the tuning solutions for you. They deserve to be compensated. So if your 121 has been bricked as a result of a failed firmware update or something like that, a voltage spike, whatever the case, yes, you can send it to me and I can unbrick it. You can update it again to 121. However, updating to 121 in one of the versions of the new software, you'd have to then go on to resync your licenses in order to be able to utilize that interface. And if that interface has been bricked as a result of piracy, it's just going to be bricked again. So I certainly am not making any assumptions, and I hope you understand that. I'm not accusing you of piracy in any way, shape, or form. I just want to explain to you and everyone else that if it has been bricked as a result of piracy, yeah, I mean, I can restore it and I can send it back to you. But the moment that you try to, update that firmware and resync those licenses, it's just going to be bricked again, and you will have wasted the money on my services. So I hope that answers your question. And hopefully that's not the instance there. And if you need that service, feel free to send me a message over on Facebook. So, okay, I am going to check just a few more messages now. Give me just a moment here. I also had a few questions about the forced firmware update in whether or not people, if they downgrade to firmware 120, they've got a legal use case, right? And let's say they go back to version 3.6. Do they need to have a completely separate laptop and make sure it never connects to the internet and so on? Yes and no. The firmware update is a part of the software that you download and you install. When you launch that application, where you go through some measures where it's polling the device, the interface, to check and see what version of firmware is on it. In the case of what I assume to be 4.4.2, it's basically going to do a quick check. It's going to poll and it's going to say, is this equal or greater to 121? If the answer is no, it's going to force a firmware update. That firmware is already inside of the software. You do not need to be connected to the internet in order for this to happen if you're using a new enough version of software. Now you could say, well, how could you possibly know that without taking the software apart? Certainly you must have reverse engineered this. Nope, not at all. Download a new version of software, disconnect from the internet, and then launch that new version of software. It's going to force a firmware update. So obviously it's not downloading it from a central server from HP Tuners. It's baked right into the program. You don't have to reverse engineer anything to determine that, yes, indeed, it is already baked into that software, and that is the manner in which it functions. It's not tough to sort that out, and as long as you don't go up to a version of software that is reaching out and polling for updates or has one of those updates baked in, you're fine. So if you do downgrade to 4.0 and change, you should be just fine. It isn't necessarily a issue with it reaching out and constantly looking for updates. But if you're concerned that it might, or things may change in the future, whatever the case may be, you just block it on a firewall. Unfortunately, that means that the newer versions of software where you've got to sync all the time to get validation this is the measures that they've put in place since the security on, their older versions of software was so fucking terrible to begin with. They're kind of actually starting to get how securing intellectual property should work. Those newer versions of software, you need to be able to allow that software to reach out and check in, what we say phoning home, phoning home on a laptop that you've got an MPVI 2 on or whatever the case may be, that's needed. If you're trying to preserve an MPVI 1 to serve a customer, with a emissions exempt diesel outside of the United States, or I have a customer that does retrofits for the Department of Defense and tunes Duramax swaps in Humvees with 4L80s behind them. That customer couldn't do anything. Okay, so we had to find a whole new solution just for them, and the amount of money that they spent was insane. HP tuners lost that because of this. Now, I'm sure that a company like that probably could have called up and, paid some silly amount of money to Keith, and Keith would have, gotten exemption from the government because they are indeed exempt, but it put such a bad taste in their mouth. They left. They went to a competitor. So, JD. Yeah, JD, it really is kind of that balancing act in thin ice. I have made it very apparent and very clear that I'm not happy with HP tuners, ultimately Keith, because he is, in this instance, essentially the person who makes the decision. But that doesn't mean that I will do anything to devalue his business, and I certainly won't condone, piracy or anything like that. I believe that he has the right to capitalize on the work that he's done. I don't believe that he has the right to remove functionality from customers who have paid for it and have a legal use for it simply because he didn't do his due diligence and secure his intellectual property. So I think that's it, guys. We've been on just over an hour now, unless there's any other questions. I, of course, will share this on a couple of the HP tuners groups on Facebook. Maybe do a TLDR or a TLDW so people can kind of understand what went on here tonight. And if there's any other questions, I can answer them. But to summarize, I still am adamant about avoiding any conversation or condoning or supporting any piracy. Some security stuff has changed regarding these interfaces. The prices on downgrading these interfaces are going to change a bit depending on some security stuff. So depending on what has happened to the interface, I don't want to speak too in depth about that. Some of them are easier to downgrade than others. So from here going forward, pricing is going to change a little bit. It's not getting, much more expensive. I need to justify my time, and that's it. I think I've been more than fair with everything that I've done so far. And the little bit of change that's going to happen is not going to be very much at all. So thank you guys very much for tuning in tonight. I assume at some point quite a few people are going to end up having to sift through this hour of rambling and rants. And hopefully I answered the questions that they asked but didn't have time to tune in for. It's Friday night. It's cold. The world's falling apart. Hopefully you guys are enjoying it. Home with loved ones, staying safe, staying healthy. And I thank you for the people who did tune in. Have a good night.